Hi, members and anyone on the podcast. Welcome back to the Salem witch trials. George Burroughs was not a Quaker, but he was under suspicion of being a Baptist. The Baptists were another Protestant sect that had legal toleration, but was considered dangerous by most Massachusetts Puritans because of their belief in adult baptism and adult-only membership in the church. Unfortunately for this mild-mannered sect, their name conjured up images of the Anabaptists of Munster, the radical polygamous extremists, who had attempted a violent overthrow of their German state in the 1530s. When the magistrates first questioned Burroughs on May 9th, they immediately asked the minister why he had failed to take communion and had not baptized his younger children, both signs that he might have become a Baptist. Burroughs' excuse was that he had never been ordained and hence could not lead the communion service, nor could he baptize children. However, he admitted that since leaving his post in Maine, he had visited Boston and Charlestown and had failed to participate in those rites there, but he could have done. Burroughs' main connections certainly placed further suspicions on him and many others. The best place to find non-Christians, apostate Puritans, and other enemies of Massachusetts Bay was, of course, the frontier. New England was a dark corner, beyond the pale of Puritan piety, the place where Satan was waiting for his moment to destroy the colony. Furthermore, it was where Puritan merchants could build vast fortunes in furs, fish, lumber, and land speculation that might tempt them away from the path of orthodoxy. Since the time of the first English settlement, Maine had been occupied mainly by Anglicans and radical Protestants. Antinomian John Wheelwright moved north to found first Exeter, New Hampshire, then Wells, Maine, after he was banished from Massachusetts in 1638. George Burdett, who was first settled in Salem in 1636, serving as assistant pastor to Hugh Peter, left, finding the discipline of the church too strict for his loose conscience, and moved to Dover, New Hampshire. He returned to politics and was elected governor, but was soon forced to leave for sundry miscarriages and foul practices. So he moved to York, Maine, but shortly after was driven out for his antinomian leanings and his advocacy for the practice of free love with several married women. Well, no surprise there. Burdett was last seen in Pemaquid, where, according to Maine's deputy governor, Thomas Gorges, his time he spends drinking, dancing, singing scurrilous songs. For his companions he selects the wretchedest people in the country. Such were the ministers who moved north from the Bay Colony to Maine. Even when the region came under the control of Massachusetts Bay, there remained a fair degree of religious latitude in Maine. Reverend Robert Jordan, an Anglican, preached on Casco Bay for almost 40 years before King Philip's War forced him to abandon the region. Just a few miles south of Casco Bay, Baptist William Milborne became the minister in Saco, Maine, in 1685, having fled Bermuda when the governor there accused him of being a fifth monarchist, a member of the revolutionary Protestant sect that believed Jesus would soon return to earth and reform English politics and society. The Baptists also established a congregation in Kittery that was in 1682, led by William Scriven. By 1692, Milborne had fled from the war zone to the safety of Boston, and authorities were harassing Scriven to the point where he would soon leave for South Carolina, where he would help found the Southern Baptist movement. Meanwhile, the only remaining minister in Maine with unquestioned Puritan credentials had been killed in a Native American raid. Reverend Shubael Dummer died in York on January 24th, 1692, during the Candlemas raid, in which more than 100 settlers were killed or taken captive. The destruction of this prosperous shire town shocked residents of Massachusetts. If York could fall, most towns north of Boston were very vulnerable. The death of the first Puritan minister at the hands of Native Americans was an ominous sign that apparently Satan was winning the war against Massachusetts. Cotton Mather soon observed that "you have seen a most pious and faithful minister lately assassinated by the brutes of our East." Dummer's death provoked Mather to make an urgent encouragement for moral reformation. "A church of saints is now lately in a manner dissipated by a sudden, furious, treacherous attack. Doubtless, the fall of one golden candlestick in our border makes noise enough to awaken all our churches unto the doing of some remarkable thing in returning to God." Reverend Dummer came from a prominent Newbury family, one of many York residents with ties to Essex County. Less than a month before the Candlemas raid, he had received money from his cousin Samuel Sewall to aid the victims of the war. Soon after the raid, Salem town parishioners voted to contribute £32, a considerable sum, to a York Relief Fund administered by Sewall and Dummer's brothers. It is probably not a coincidence that afflictions increased in the Paris household in the wake of the Candlemas raid, which offered just one more reason to be suspicious of George Burroughs. Burroughs had left Falmouth to live in Wells shortly before the town fell to a combined native and French force, resulting in the death of most of the defenders. Some wondered why Burroughs had managed to avoid the fate of Shubael Dummer. Burroughs' accusation solidified the link between witchcraft, the frontier, and attacks on orthodoxy. Burroughs' examination represented the first time in the witch trials that the question of baptism was raised, an issue that subsequently would play an important role, as many of the accused described their baptism by Satan during the proceedings. Okay, that bit's thrown me off guard, and I'll tell you why. Satan cannot baptize people, okay? I just want to make that clear. I don't know what they think they're talking about when they suggest Satan did baptize these people, but that's not what Satan's about. He definitely does not go around baptizing people, guys. Just want to make that clear. Wow. The connection seems clear. While Salem Village and other communities, particularly those that refused to accept the halfway covenant, struggled to maintain membership, Satan had no problem growing his ranks, especially with George Burroughs and other ministers leading his black masses, assisting with adult baptisms, just like the Baptists, and recruiting people to sign the satanic covenant in the devil's book. Okay, what they are talking about is just a different religion, guys, okay? That's all they're talking about. They're talking about how Burroughs will baptise adults, but he's explained to them he does not have the credentials to baptise children, unfortunately. You did have to have a particular amount of credentials back then to perform baptisms. It was a ranking status, you know. But adults, he could, because he had the criteria for, but he couldn't children because he did not. So that's where they get the idea that these baptisms is doing, they're for Satan. It's very interesting. It's a lot of crap, guys. Furthermore, once Burroughs was charged, practically anyone would fall under suspicion. 4 ministers would subsequently be cried out upon during the witch trials. This did not go without notice in 1692. Writing from Boston on July 11th, 1692, Jacob Melian noted, "They accuse many honest people of being sorcerers and witches. naming 3 or 4 ministers, and one of them lies in irons, and some 200 have been accused. Historians have given little attention to Samuel Willard, Francis Dane, John Bussey, and Jeremiah Shepherd, for none was ever formally charged. But they form an important part of the overlooked pattern of accusations against ministers and their families. 20 of the 172 accused, that's 11%, were ministers of their close relatives. In all, 5 ministers, 4 ministers' wives, 3 daughters, a son, 2 brothers, and 5 grandchildren of ministers were cried out upon. Warrants were issued for only 5 of the 20, and only 2, Burroughs and Abigail Dane Faulkner, daughter of Andover's Reverend Francis Dane, would face the court of oyer intermina. The number grows to 50 if one includes extended kin and in-laws of ministers. Fully 30% of the people accused in 1692. Admittedly, Francis Dane and his family account for 28 of those 50. But this is still a remarkable coincidence, one that calls for exploration and explanation. Virtually all of the ministers who were accused or had family accused preached in New England churches and had accepted the halfway covenant. One notable exception was Job Tukey, the son, grandson and great-grandson of English ministers. Job's former employer had called his father an Anabaptistical, quaking rogue that for his maintenance went up and down England to delude souls with the devil. Job Tukey defended his father as a religious, godly man with solid Puritan credentials. But the slander may have spread and even seemed believable to Samuel Parris and his conservative supporters, given Tukey's lowly status as a transient sailor and a fisherman who had spent time on the coast of Maine. Also accused were people who seemingly were devout Puritans, given Salem villagers' refusal to accept the halfway covenant. There may have been concerns about Orthodox ministers who supported it. John Higginson, the father of accused Anne Dolliver, had almost threatened to resign his post in Salem town if the church did not attempt the halfway covenant. The accusation against Margaret Thatcher may have stemmed from her ties to the frontier. In 1692, she still owed frontier lands, including a sawmill in Cocheco, Dover, New Hampshire, inherited from her father and her first husband, both very wealthy Boston merchants. Thatcher also may have been the mistress of Mercy Short, an afflicted girl with ties to the frontier. However, Thatcher's second husband, the late Peter Thacker, had been the founding pastor for Boston's Third Church. The congregation had been established specifically on the principle of the halfway covenant. Thatcher's successor was Samuel Willard, who, like Margaret, was cried out upon and never brought up on charges. It's not the one that you think. It's spelt different, guys. Thatcher is spelt Thaccher. So it's it's different, okay? Perhaps Willard was accused because of his early opposition to the trials, as voiced in sermons he gave during the summer of 1692. If a late account is to be believed, Willard and Joshua Moody, the assistant pastor of Boston's First Church, were instrumental in helping Philip and Mary English to flee jail in Boston and gain refuge in New York. This story could explain why Moody's wife, Anne, was accused of witchcraft, for those people who opposed the trials or questioned their authority were targeted. Likewise, even witchcraft judge Major Nathaniel Saltonstall was accused after he had left the bench, possibly because he was dissatisfied with the proceedings. It should also be noted that Saltonstall was the son-in-law of Haverhill's Reverend John Ward. Like Willard, John Boos was cried out upon but escaped formal charges of witchcraft. Boos's case demonstrates that it took multiple factors to trigger an accusation, especially for a minister. Boos's frontier residency and the fact that his mother-in-law, Mary Bradbury, was charged with witchcraft presumably led 4 people to cry out against him in court. The accusers placed him alongside George Burroughs, assisting with satanic baptisms and black masses. Richard Barker called him a ringleader at one gathering where the witches were all by Mr. Booth, and the black man exhorted to pull down the kingdom of Christ and set up the kingdom of the devil. The connection to Burroughs was natural. Booth had even served in Wales, leaving 1677 to become parson and physician in the Oyster River section of Dover, New Hampshire. Oyster River is present-day Durham, by the way. Years later, he would recount that he had laboured in Oyster River in the time of the late terrible Indian War, when many a score fell by the sword, both upon ye right hand and the left, and several others forced to fight for want of bread, and still managed to hold services in the garrison every Lord's day as God did enable him. His service came at a price. The Joseph and William Booth killed by natives during the Dover raid in 1689 were probably his sons, and in 1694 his house and valuable library would be destroyed in another Native American raid. Interesting indeed. Do you see how the pattern is coming about? And there's definitely a pattern, isn't there? As you can see, looking at this, the witch trials is definitely more religion-based and biased. It's not very good, that, is it? Not for the fact that we're talking about hanging innocent people, you know? It's crazy, guys. It's just crazy. Thank you for listening to this part of The Accused. When we come back, we shall obviously continue. And many blessings.